tragedy has struck at the beating heart of French culture. A fire destroyed the roof and Gothic spire of Notre-Dame Cathedral.
Welcome to Plain English, the podcast that goes at the right speed for English language learners. Listen now and read the transcript online at plainenglish.com. Now, here's Jeff, your host for today's episode.
Hi again, this is Jeff, and welcome back to Plain English. Today's episode is really long, so let's not waste too much time up front here. But real quick, the episode number is 149, so you can find the full transcript and all the translations into French, Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and Japanese on the website at plainenglish.com/149. I'd also like to remind you to join our email list for some extra English learning resources. You can join that list by going to plainenglish.com/mail, M-A-I-L. And remember, we have a new feature on the program today, JR's Song of the Week. So stay tuned for that toward the end of today's episode. It was the Monday of Christianity's Holy Week, the week between Palm Sunday and Easter. The final Mass of the day was being celebrated in Notre-Dame Cathedral when a fire alarm went off around 6:30 in the evening, causing all the worshipers to evacuate. They had no way of knowing, as they walked quickly out, that day, that moment, would divide the history of Notre Dame into a before and an after. The fire that set off that alarm would ravage the 850-year-old landmark. By the time the blaze was completely extinguished, 15 hours later, it had badly scarred one of the most important religious landmarks in the Western world, delivering a blow to believers and non-believers alike, and striking at the heart of the French nation. Orange flames consumed the roof of the cathedral and sent a plume of thick smoke into the air above Paris. Thousands of people gathered at Paris's City Hall, the Hôtel de Ville, and watched in disbelief as one of the symbols of France and Catholicism went up in flames. An hour into the fire, the famed Gothic spire, the tall structure that was visible from many parts of Paris, collapsed and fell into the cathedral's interior. Notre Dame had survived a lot before. 2 world wars, including the Nazi occupation of Paris in 1940, looting during the French Revolution, ransacking during religious wars, the full history of disease, famine, and war that characterized Europe over the centuries. However, this was the worst trial yet in its almost 1,000-year history. Onlookers in Paris and by that time around the world on television wondered, how could Notre-Dame survive a fire this big, this bad? And how could France? Somehow, the great cathedral survived, and so will France. By Tuesday morning, Parisian firefighters announced that the fire was out. The spire was long gone. It crashed through the ceiling and landed in a smoldering pile near the altar. Much of the roof was also destroyed. The fate of the priceless relics and artwork inside was unknown, but during Tuesday it became clear that the famed limestone towers and the main structure of the cathedral would survive. The worst had been avoided, but just barely. Parisian authorities said that the cathedral was within 15 to 30 minutes of damage severe enough to cause the whole building to fall. For hours after the blaze, stones fell off the sides of the building onto the surrounding streets. There are still questions about the building's structural integrity. The stone exterior was heated during the fire and then doused with water, both factors that could weaken the building, but it was still standing. How did this happen? During the following week, more details became clear. Notre-Dame was undergoing a 150 million euro restoration, and there was scaffolding near the Gothic spire and around the roof. Investigators now believe an electrical short circuit started the fire in the roof near the spire. It was the worst possible place for a fire to start. Here's why. The cathedral had, and I can't believe I'm saying had in the past tense, but the cathedral had a lead roof. Lead is a heavy, durable metal, so it needed a strong support system underneath it. The original artisans who built the cathedral created a complex network of strong wooden beams to hold up this really heavy roof. Each wooden beam was cut from a different oak tree, so architects gave this section of the cathedral a nickname: the forest. The forest was always invisible to visitors, but many architects consider it to be the most ingenious and beautiful part of the cathedral. It was also the most fire-prone. Those wooden beams were part of the original construction of the cathedral, and they have dried out over the centuries. There were no firewalls to stop the spread of flames. Dry wood, plenty of air, inaccessible to firefighters. It was a recipe for disaster. There's more. Notre-Dame was not equipped with the fire prevention safeguards that are in place in more modern buildings. Things like sprinkler systems and firewalls. These protections have been added to other ancient structures in Europe, but they were not added to Notre-Dame. In part, this was done on purpose. They feared that adding electrical wiring for things like smoke detectors and sprinklers was a greater risk of starting a fire. And of course, there is also the natural desire not to make alterations to a historical monument. But those decisions not to install the safeguards came with terrible consequences later. There is some good news. An art historian from Vassar College in the United States captured every detail of Notre-Dame's construction using laser image technology in 2015, and it is all recorded in a digital archive. To capture all this information, he set up a precise laser in 50 locations in the building. The laser would sweep around in all directions, measuring the time it took for the beam to return. And when put together, the observations from all those laser scans created the most detailed 3D image of the cathedral possible. The project collected over 1 billion data points, and the image is accurate to within 5 millimeters. The images will be used in the reconstruction to make it as true to the original as possible. Notre-Dame Cathedral is known as a symbol of Paris and the French nation. About 13 million people visit each year, making it the most visited tourist attraction in France. More popular even than the Eiffel Tower. It was constructed on a small island, Île de la Cité, in the River Seine. Construction began in the year 1163, and it was completed in the year 1345, almost 2 centuries later. Thousands of artisans toiled for years, never to see the completed product. It is considered one of the finest examples of medieval Gothic architecture and is known for its decorative gargoyles and the flying buttresses that hold up the cathedral's walls. Paris's Point Zero, the spot from which all distances in Paris are measured, is just outside its doors. Notre-Dame was not always well preserved. In the early 19th century, it had fallen into disrepair, so much so that the French novelist Victor Hugo wrote a novel intended as a call to preserve the old cathedral. The novel was called Notre-Dame of Paris and was later published in English under the title The Hunchback of Notre-Dame. The novel did indeed focus attention on the cathedral's history and beauty, and it underwent a series of preservations in the decades since the novel's publication. The novel was later popularized by the Disney movie of the same name. You may have seen it. French President Emmanuel Macron, often seen as aloof and disconnected from the French people, he rose to the occasion and struck exactly the right tone in the hours that followed. In a message to the French people, he said that he knew the sadness and trembling inside that the citizens of France were feeling, adding that Notre-Dame was the epicenter of French life. He pledged that Notre-Dame would be reconstructed within 5 years. Although France is a country without a great tradition of private philanthropy, within hours of the blaze, businesses and individuals had pledged over 1 billion euros toward its restoration. Speaking of that roof, I was reading an article that was describing the huge beams used to build it. Remember, it was original to the building, and in order to get the beams strong enough for the job at the time, the architects needed to find trees that were already about 300 to 400 years old at that time. So think about it. The part that burned was from trees that were already 400 years old, 850 years ago. So do the math on that. The wood was created. It grew out of the ground starting 1100 or 1200 years ago. There is one part of this story that I didn't talk about in this episode, and that is the heroic efforts of the firefighters to save the historical treasures that had been in Notre-Dame when the fire broke out. It's an incredible story what they did, and I didn't want to try to fit it all into today's episode. So we'll do an episode about that in the next few weeks. Not Monday, but maybe next week or the week after. I want to say hi to a couple of listeners today. First, big hello to Manuela from beautiful Medellin, Colombia. You know that is one of my favorite places that I've visited. Manuela lives in the U.S. now, and she works as a nanny for 4 11-month-old kids. Talk about having your hands full. Imagine looking after 4 little 1-year-olds. Manuela sent me a great audio message saying that learning English makes her day a little easier, and plain English is a part of that. So I wanted to say thank you to Manuela for sending me that note. Also, a quick hi to Ismael from Rio. He's studying actuarial science, and Lineker, a Cubano who is living in Miami. He's having trouble finding English speakers to talk to in Miami. Can you believe that? Well, I'm glad to help whether you're in the U.S. or abroad. And if you'd like to connect with us, send me an email to Jeff, Jeff, at plainenglish.com, or connect on WhatsApp with the number +1 312 967 8757. Now, today's main story was longer than usual, so we'll do a quick phrase, a recipe for disaster. When something is a recipe for disaster, it means all the factors needed for a disaster are in place. Like I said before, the forest atop Notre-Dame was a recipe for disaster. Dry wood, lots of air, and not easily accessible to firefighters. not to mention the fact that Notre-Dame itself is on a tiny, inaccessible island in Paris. Everything you needed for a disaster was there. It was a recipe for disaster. Do you remember the dam that collapsed in Brazil? It just buried this town under a river of mud. What did we have in that case? The mines were not well inspected. The companies cut corners in constructing them. That means they did them cheaply and didn't do a high-quality job. In previous dam collapses, including one by the same company, nobody was really punished, so the mining companies were not really afraid of what would happen to them if something went wrong. So is it any surprise that it happened again? It sounds like that was a recipe for disaster. All the factors you need for a disaster were there. Boeing. I hate to keep bringing this up again, but that plane was rushed to market. They didn't give the pilots enough training. The 737 MAX was so complex, and Boeing tried to pretend it was just like previous 737s when really important parts of its computer system were actually new, and some of the safety features were optional and not installed on all of the planes. That was a recipe for disaster. You can also use this term in a light-hearted way. Here's a recipe for disaster. Me trying to paint a room. First of all, I don't have enough time, so I'm likely to try to rush through it. Second of all, I'm not very handy around the house, if you know what I mean. I can change a light bulb and I can hang a picture, but that's about it. My talents are elsewhere, shall we say. I'm no good with painting tape. I don't spread the paint evenly on the wall. If I try to paint a room in my apartment, well, let's just say that's a recipe for disaster. Okay, there you have it. 4 examples of a recipe for disaster. Now, the moment you've all been waiting for, JR's Song of the Week. To get us going, JR picked a song of his own, but in the future, we will be accepting nominations for the Song of the Week, and we are putting together a Spotify playlist too, so stay tuned for that. The song JR picked is Livin' on a Prayer by Bon Jovi. It came out in 1988 and talks about a conventional couple. The man is working, the wife is at home, and they hope that if they stick by each other, that will be enough to reach their goals and achieve their dreams. It is kind of like an anthem for the state of New Jersey, where John Bon Jovi is from, and it's a popular cover song for rock bands, karaoke, weddings. It's all over the radio, places like that. Livin' on a Prayer by Bon Jovi is the first song of the week chosen by JR, so check that one out for a classic American rock song, a staple of karaoke and weddings all over the United States. So that's all for today's episode. Thanks for being with us on Plain English. JR and I will be back with a new episode on Monday. You won't want to miss it. Don't forget to sign up for the episode emails by going to plainenglish.com/mail. See you Monday.